Today, my guest is Professor Jennifer Oetzel. I will keep my introduction short to maximize our time with her. In the next 30 minutes or so, we'll talk about Jennifer as a person, Professor Oetzel as a thought leader and an esteemed scholar, and finally as a mentor to many PhD students and junior faculty. For the sake of time, I will skip many of her accomplishments and give you a very quick snapshot. Professor Oetzel is the 2018 Emerald Literati Award winner for her paper at Multinational Business Review, received the Best Paper Award at European International Business Association meeting in 2016, the Best Paper Award at AOM meetings in 2015, and she was a finalist for Haynes Prize for the Most Promising Scholar at 2009 AIB conference. She sits on the editorial boards of SMJ, JIBS, Journal of International Business Policy, and Journal of World Business. And she's an active AIB member and has served as a session chair, co-track chair in several AIB annual conferences. And she was a co-organizer of the Doctoral Consortium at 2016 AIB. Thank you, Jennifer, for joining us.
Oh, thank you so much for inviting me, Olga. It's nice to be here.
Jennifer, what did you want to become when you were a child?
Well, it's kind of funny. I think the first thought I had was being a rock star. But you have to sing and play an instrument, so that kind of makes that very difficult for me. But I went to a concert where U2 actually opened up for the Police. They were the opening band. If you can imagine, when I was 14, and yeah, it doesn't get better than that. But I unfortunately had to choose something else.
And where did you grow up?
I grew up in a couple different places. I lived in a suburb of Chicago until I was about 9. And then we moved north of Chicago for a couple of years and then moved to a very small town outside of Austin, Texas. And that was certainly one of the biggest cultural changes I ever had. So.
And can you remember the difference between domestic versus international as a child?
Sure. I think the earliest memory I have of that is when my dad always got the National Geographic, and he loved talking about other countries, and he always knew who the leader was in every country. But it was funny because he never really wanted to travel at all. So despite this, intense interest he had, he didn't really have a lot of interest in traveling. But we did move around quite a bit. And then I was fascinated just by how different the culture is in the United States. And it just made, and because of, I guess, that initial family interest, I was always curious about how people did things in different places and kind of this international versus domestic differences.
Interesting. How did you choose academia?
Let's see. Well, it took a lot of thinking, but I always enjoyed school, and I particularly in college. And I had a great professor who was an economic development expert, and he had worked in India for 30 years, but he talked a lot about, he was very inspirational as a professor. And so I thought, this is kind of brings together my interest in international and economic development. How do you improve the lives of other people in less developed countries?
I see.
And then I guess the academic part came later as a trial and error, trying different things, different ways of addressing, trying to get into that field of economic development, and then thinking about whether should it be an NGO, should I work for government, how should I approach this? And when I was doing my master's degree in urban planning at University of Texas at Austin, I met several professors. I worked in the business school, and I was amazed at how the range of topics that they were studying. And I really saw that as an excellent fit for me, and which I hadn't considered before. I thought about getting a Ph.D. in economics, but then that really changed my mind. And people there were very helpful in kind of, helping guide me towards the Ph.D. program. And so that was fantastic.
And who was your advisor?
My advisor at I went for my master's at University of Texas at Austin, and then did my PhD at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where I worked with Rich Bettis. And he was a great advisor and definitely made a big difference in my career.
Sure. Something that is not on your CV that people would find interesting.
I love to be outdoors, and this summer there's 58 mountains in Colorado that are above 14,000 feet. And this summer I'm going to climb, my objective is to climb the tallest, although it's not the most difficult, but it's the tallest at 14,400 and change feet. And so that's one of the things I'm going to do. I think I like Colorado because it's a kind of opposite my personality a bit. People, are very relaxed about work, and they, take it easy, and they have powder days where nobody works if it snows. And so that's completely opposite of me. So it's good. It's a good change occasionally.
And when you say mountain climbing, we're talking about with ropes, you're scaling the.
No, luckily I don't do that, but it's hiking. Luckily it's all hiking. So.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. If you stop doing what you're doing today, what's the second best alternative career path for you?
Well, the other thing I'd always thought about doing was to work in the field as a development expert, I guess. When I was thinking about what to do, and I knew that I wanted to pursue a PhD, but when I was an undergraduate, I would look through the back of The Economist all the time and say, oh my gosh, that job sounds so great. But all of them, required a PhD. And so I thought that would be a fabulous career. You can travel all over the world, work on development projects. And I think just later on in my life, I realized that I wanted to have a family and didn't want to travel quite that much, as some people are gone, weeks or months at a time. And so I think that was a big factor in not going in that direction.
Oh, yeah. About regrets, have you got any regrets?
I can't say that I have any regrets, maybe just the rock star part, but one thing I did when I was younger is I tried every possible angle. When I was in, right after I graduated, there was a work abroad program where US citizens could get work visas to a few countries. And so I went to London, and I tried international law. I was fortunate and got a job at an international law firm. And it was fantastic, but I decided that's not quite what I wanted to do. And so then I worked in Tunisia, North Africa on an economic development project during my master's program, which I absolutely loved, but decided maybe not, working for maybe I didn't want to work for an NGO. I think that experience was very pivotal for me, because I was evaluating a US technology transfer project that educated Tunisians in the US. And then in science and engineering, with the notion that they would bring that science knowledge back to Tunisia. The US had done this in many countries, but this was the largest of its kind and considered a failure at the time, because only a little over half had gone back. But to a person, so my job was to interview students in the US and in Tunisia to find out what their experiences were and why people didn't go back. And to a person, everybody said, I just want to get ahead. I just want a job where I'm treated with fairness and I get ahead based on my merits and not based on who my cousin is. And that was a very powerful, it sounds very simple, but it was a very powerful experience for me to just see again how rare it is to have a job where you get ahead based on your merits and how valuable that is. And we have those issues in the United States, to be sure. But that's what made me very interested in business as a focus of my career.
Is that program still alive, training?
Yeah, unfortunately not. It was with IEE, which was an international educational exchange program, and they don't do that anymore. It was some years later that they ended that. I think I'm not sure exactly why, but yeah, that was a great program. It's wonderful to have more of those.
It sounds interesting. About your passion, what are you most passionate about?
Well, I guess especially when obviously my family, and I have a daughter, and that's fantastic. I guess work-wise, I'm most passionate about, well, I probably am too serious in some ways, but I think about like, how can I make a difference? I'm not sure why, but this focus on why some countries are more developed than others, why some people are born into difficult situations while others are not, and how can we change that? Those are kind of the things I have thought about a lot over the years.
Perfect. Can we talk about research now?
Yes.
And in research, how do you explain what you do and why your work is important to people who don't read your work regularly?
Well, if I guess I was going to put it in those terms, I would say that peace is good for business and it's good for society. And then the background on how I got to that notion is that I studied risk for so many years because when I was looking at factors that undermine development, one of the key characteristics of less developed countries is they tend to have a great deal of risk, political risk, economic risk, social risk. And I focused a great deal on that for many years, and I still am. But then I also along the way became very interested in, we study risk, but if we don't study the factors that create more peaceful environments and favorable environments for business, we won't, it would be very difficult to understand how we get there, how a country changes from conflict affected to more peaceful, and how do we understand that? And so, yeah, I really became very interested in this notion of peace building and what role businesses play. And I think the peace dividend paper, there was in Northern Ireland during the height of the conflict there, and it was when it was incredibly difficult to resolve, obviously, for many years. One pivotal point was when business associations in Northern Ireland got together and put together a document called the Peace Dividend Paper that showed how much the conflict was costing society in terms of lost money. Basically, they looked at all the money that went to funding arms that could have gone to schools, the fact that it could have gone to healthcare. And it reportedly had a major impact on how people thought about the conflict and the society they wanted. So those are the kind of things I've been thinking about. And I think, most people can relate to that idea, unfortunately, especially today in almost every country, including the US, we see pieces, sometimes we take it for granted if we've had it for a while, and we see it can be lost very quickly, like we saw on January 6th.
Sure. Well, in my research, I find the top 18 countries in the world are the ones who have fought most wars, have been involved in more crises, conflicts, military and political. So true, it is good for the society, peace, but conflict actually has been one of the drivers, locomotives for these rich countries. So let's talk about omitted variables or things that are underdeveloped, underutilized in IB research. What are some of the things not underappreciated, but omitted?
Let's see, I guess I would say rather than a specific variable, I would suggest maybe it's, and this is not just IB, maybe it's management and strategy more generally too, but it's the notion of what is a normative versus an instrumental idea. I think a lot of times we look at instrumental notion is when you look at the bottom line and it's supposed to be kind of value neutral, whereas normative ideas tend to, are value laden, and then therefore they're considered more subjective. But I think that as we look at the role of business in society now, and as particularly there's, we see that on the front page all of the time. And when I see, unfortunately, something like, business schools, really, we all have admired McKinsey, and we say, why don't we all place our students there? It's a very prestigious placement. But then we have, they just got fined $600 million for their role in helping Purdue Pharma, promote opioid addiction, essentially developing strategies that would make people more addicted over time. And so I think, we often in my opinion, I feel like we have to, it's important to also not necessarily consider that an instrumental approach just simply because it's maximizing returns, but look at how can we rethink, the bottom line, and is there a limit, and how do we think about that in a way that doesn't get bogged down into kind of a value-based argument. So it's something that I'm still grappling with and thinking a lot about. And I think that, we see a lot of interest in this whole idea of what role does business play when we look at Facebook and other companies. It's not an easy question, to be sure.
Mm-hmm. And what are these interesting trends that you see in the field? A PhD student comes to you and says, I want to work on a dissertation. What is the interesting field for the next 5 to 10 years? Asking about the blue ocean, where's the blue ocean? So what would you say? What are the interesting areas to work in?
Sure. One of the things that I definitely think is that students often come in with great ideas, and that a main issue is how do you translate that into academic work? So sometimes I think you can actually come in with really interesting ideas that may not have been introduced into the literature already. So there's an opportunity there to kind of talk to them about some of the things that maybe academics who've been working for a long time haven't been thinking about. But having said that, I think some of the areas and areas of development in IB have been looking at less developed countries to some degree. That's changed a lot over time. This idea of globalization and deglobalization certainly is going to be of great interest in the coming years and how it affects business strategy. And then I think it's, part of, I think it's very helpful to get students to kind of explore their own passions and interests. And that's can be stimulating for the people working with them as well. And not to lose sight of what brought them there.
Thank you. Jennifer, about creativity in research. You've seen people with great ideas, great papers. You have great papers yourself.
Thank you.
How do you come up with these interesting topics? Where does creativity come from?
Yeah. Let's see. Well, I guess it's just partly just exploring. I've learned from, been very interested in what other people are doing. That was very stimulating. I first got interested in this idea with one of my co-authors, Kathy Getz, who's now a dean at Loyola in Maryland, and Tim Fort, who's a professor in Indiana. And they were initially brought up these ideas of peace building. And at first, it seems, wow, that's really, it's hard to that doesn't seem like something we normally study. And that's when I first began thinking about that about 15 or more years ago. But that it felt so different that it also feels very stimulating and creative and to think more about it. And when I started looking and realizing that's actually a lot of businesses and NGOs were working in that space already, that got me even more interested. And so I think, constantly exploring new ideas that are already related to general topics that you're interested in is, and looking beyond necessarily kind of academic articles as well as popular press and learning what's going on in the world and thinking about what is most, is your own passion, I guess.
About IB scholarship, if you talk about an evolution in IB scholarship from past to the current and to the future, but what can you say about what did we lose, what did we gain along the way, and where are we going?
Well, I think it's very exciting. I love, AIB is such a stimulating organization with great people, great ideas, and we have benefit from the variety of fields that people come from too. So I think that's very exciting. In terms of the directions, I can't help but look a little bit, from management and strategy perspective, since that's where my base. But I think this idea of where the role of business and society, I think, is only going to get more attention because it's very complex and hard to answer. Some studies have come out recently to show that CSR efforts are actually we rarely measure the impact of CSR efforts. And that's by, Mike Barnett, Irene Enriquez, and I believe, I'm terrible at forgetting the last author there, but they did an amazing study of, all CSR, papers looking at, saying that they had impact and then looking at whether they did and find that hardly any do, or the fact that we just don't measure that. So I think that's an interesting direction given the attention that CSR has. And I guess I would say that. And then, you never know. Some things that haven't gotten attention in a while may suddenly become much more interesting given whatever's happening in the world as well.
What are you currently working on?
Let's see, I'm currently working on a book on climate adaptation. So as part of another risk that can, affect society. And so that's going to be coming out in Cambridge Press this fall. I am also working on a couple of papers looking at how do we better understand peace if a country is in conflict, but starts moving towards a more peaceful environment. And how do we assess that as a potential investment location? What are the characteristics that might indicate it's going to be a more attractive place, or is it going to retreat back into conflict? And so those are some of the areas that I'm working on directly at the moment.
Beautiful, thank you. About advice, you mentioned Rich Bettis. What was the best advice you received from Rich Bettis?
He gave me one many, but one that I remember the most is he said, there's many smart people in the world, but you want to find the good people who are smart. And he said, he really emphasized that a lot. And I think I've been very fortunate in all the co-authors that I've had and the people I've worked with it really has, I've lived that out. And I'm so glad to get that piece of advice to always think about it, not necessarily look at it in those terms. And that makes the whole process of writing so rewarding too, because doing the paper is really fun, and collaborating with people you really like is great. So I'm really fortunate that it's worked out that way. So.
Jennifer, with the junior faculty or PhD students that you meet over the years, what are some of the common mistakes that they do, things that they do that you say, like, don't do that, this is not a good way to build a career? What are the things that you would say these are problems, so that what's your advice to the young scholars?
I guess one very valuable thing is just to get to know people and to make sure, sometimes when people are first starting out, they feel nervous and, reluctant to talk to people. And I think, the vast majority of people are going to be very receptive, and especially at any AIB conference I've been to, people are very receptive to talk. And if they can't talk at that moment, they'll be happy to schedule something. And I would never hesitate to reach out. And I think, that's probably the biggest problem. And then, or the biggest, barrier that people may feel at that point in time. I think generally speaking, it's less about the methodological capabilities and things like that people are usually pretty well prepared and they leave their PhD programs. The other thing is about at least it was also for me, the peer review process in journals. That can be a hard skill to crack. And it definitely is a skill in learning how to respond to reviewers, and how do you interpret a review, and getting advice from other people in terms of reading your papers as you're going along in the process. I think sometimes maybe people feel reluctant to let other people view their work, and they're going to think it's not good, or they're not going to look at the review and say, this is not great. But I think it's absolutely the opposite. People are very happy to help. And I think that was the thing I struggled with the most early on, is just kind of understanding how to, respond to reviewers. And
let's expand on that one. How should they respond to reviewers?
It's more about, I guess, just knowing the way you talk to what the reviewers want to hear, just having a better understanding of what they want to hear, how you frame it. Now it seems like second nature. So it's, when I'm looking back, I'm thinking, I guess I just, it's a skill. It's a very much a skill, just like any kind of empirical method in terms of, how do I respond? What is the most important issue here? How do I address it? How can I go above and beyond what they're asking so that I, make sure I've thoroughly addressed everything and done even more, show the reviewers respect because they've devoted a lot of time, and most reviewers give good advice that's well-intentioned. And I have to say that throughout, every paper I really do is, as long and hard as it might be, it is better at the end of a review process. So it's more about, I think in some PhD programs, maybe there's a lot of training on that. We certainly had some in my program, but I felt like maybe that's just the one thing that didn't come as natural as other things. So.
How did you guys train people to respond to letters, to response letters? What's the format?
Well, at the time I was in school, Jeff Edwards was teaching our methods class. So all the PhD students went through methods. And one of the things he did is he put forward his letters that he had gotten back on some of his papers. And so then, it was fun to read because sometimes it also makes you feel better. And maybe that's one good idea for PhD students, because then you see, well, everybody, these scathing reviews with ultimately good papers, often happen. And so how do you work with that and get from there to a publication? How do you respond to something like that if you want to pursue the R&R? And then also just what do they want to hear? So that part got me really thinking a lot about those issues, I think. But yeah, sometimes they're easier to respond to than others. So I think, so it's easier to follow the advice than other times.
Sometimes the referee asks for more data, new theory, new front end.
Yeah, exactly. You have to think, do I want to, is this the one I should pursue or not?
Well, for the sake of time, what is a question that I should have asked you but haven't?
Well, I think you've done a very good job. I'm not sure that I can think of one off the top of my head, but I think you covered a lot of space. I'm trying to think if there's anything. I can't think of anything at the moment that you should have asked, but let's see. What about you? Any other topics that you're interested in?
I would like to go back to the advice portion on, you said they are, the junior faculty and the patients are good in methodology. There's this debate that young people, young scholars should be involved in more theorizing and more theory writing and empirical, although they go with the empirical papers first because the job market requires empirical papers first. I'm curious what you think about the new approach that suggests that PhD students should be working in theory building front end because they are very fresh. The theories are fresh in their mind. They can make different connections, and they are not limited by seeking little gaps in the literature. What do you think about that?
I think students need to understand where the literature has been, and in order to contribute to it. So that's a key part of the academic process, I think. But sometimes I think often we get so bogged down in the theory development that we lose sight of what's important in the research. So I think and in fact, I think we're seeing that in many journals now, where there's either opening more space for, certainly articles that are grounded in theory, but not necessarily with the main point of contributing to theory development. So I think that actually we're seeing a trend a little bit, not away entirely from that, but with a broader range of options in terms of how you conduct your scholarship. And I think there's more interest in I think many people now have an interest in having an impact on practice, whatever that means to them.
Sure. Thank you so much for your time. I really enjoyed it. I learned a lot. I'm sure the audience will agree with me. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much.